My son called me from a number I didn't recognize on a Tuesday evening in November, and the first thing he said wasn't hello. It was, "Mom, they arrested me." I swear I didn't do anything. I was standing at my kitchen counter, peeling sweet potatoes for dinner. The peeler dropped and clattered against the sink. Behind me, the refrigerator was still covered in crayon drawings my grandson left from his summer visit. Everything in that kitchen looked exactly the same as it had 5 seconds ago, and yet nothing was. "Where are you?" I kept my voice even. 31 years of being a high school principal does that to you. You learn to hold the floor no matter what walks through your door. Charlotte Mecklenburg Detention Center. "Mom, I need you to." "I know what you need. Don't say another word until I get there." I hung up, turned off the stove, picked up my peeler, and set it in the dish rack. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and let myself shake for exactly 45 seconds because I knew once I stood back up, I wouldn't have time for that again. My name is Cleo Jarvis. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years shaping young people's futures at Westbrook High outside of Birmingham, Alabama, and before that, my mama spent 20 years cleaning houses, and my daddy spent 25 years loading trucks so that their children could do something with their lives. We built everything we have from scratch and held on to it with both hands. My son Quinton is 34, civil engineer, graduated top of his program at NC State, moved to Charlotte, built a good career at a mid-size infrastructure firm. He is careful, deliberate, and honest to a fault. The kind of man who returns overpayments without being asked, who reads the fine print, who checks his work twice. His father, God rest him, would have been so proud. 4 years ago, Quentin met his wife at a work function. She came from one of those old Charlotte families, the kind whose names are on buildings. Her mother, Windham, ran the Windham Housing Cooperative, a nonprofit that claimed to build affordable homes for working families across the Carolinas. Her father, Windham, was a real estate developer who spent more time at his place in Hilton Head than he did in Charlotte. I tried to like Greer. I tried for 4 years. But there are people who smile at you so deliberately that you can see the calculation behind it. People who are always, on some level, deciding what you're worth. That was Windham. She looked at me the way people look at furniture that doesn't match the room. Polite enough, just never warm. She had never been warm to Quinton either, not really. He was talented and accomplished, and she couldn't deny that. But he was also the grandson of a truck loader and the son of a principal from Birmingham, and to Windham, that meant something. Or rather, that it didn't mean enough. I'm getting ahead of myself. When I walked into that detention center on a Tuesday night, my son looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. He probably hadn't. He sat across from me in a gray room and said, "They're saying I redirected project funds. $300,000 from the Windham Cooperative's community renovation account." "Did you?" He looked at me like I'd struck him. "Quentin," I leaned forward. "I'm your mother. I know you didn't, but I need to hear you say it." "No." His voice didn't waver. "I was managing the account as a contracted engineer. I had access. Someone used my credentials, forged 2 authorization signatures that look like mine. Who knew your login?" He was quiet for a moment. "His wife would have access," I said, not asked, said. "Mom, does she know your passwords?" He looked down at the table. Quinton had always protected his wife, even when I could see the way she stepped back whenever her mother made a cutting remark at Sunday dinners. Even when he'd call me on weekend evenings sounding tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. He loved her, and he had a habit, like his father, of protecting the people he loved even when they didn't deserve it. I drove home that night on I-85 with the windows down despite the cold. I needed the air. I needed to think. My sister Dorinda has lived in Raleigh for the past 12 years. She spent 22 years as a sheriff's deputy in Wake County before her knees forced an early retirement. She is 4 years younger than me, 2 inches taller, and approximately 3 times more stubborn. She was also the person I called before I even pulled out of the detention center parking lot. "I'll be there by morning," she said, before I'd finished the second sentence. "You don't have to." "Cleo, I'll be there by morning." She was. She pulled up to my hotel at 6:47 a.m. with a travel mug of coffee for each of us and a legal pad already full of notes. That's my sister. She doesn't comfort you with words. She shows up with coffee and a plan. We spent that first morning going through everything Quentin had told me. The project in question was a renovation contract. 12 older apartment buildings in East Charlotte, supposedly being updated for low-income residents. Quentin had been brought in to oversee the structural engineering assessment and had access to the Windham Cooperative's project account to coordinate contractor payments. The money, $300,000, had been transferred in 4 separate transactions over 6 weeks. Each transfer had a work order attached. Each work order bore what appeared to be Quentin's digital signature. "These transfer timestamps," Dorinda said, spreading the printouts across the hotel bed. 3 of the 4 happened on weekdays between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. She looked up at me. "Where was Quentin those afternoons?" We checked against his calendar, site visits, field work, away from his desk, away from his computer, away from any device that would have logged his credentials. Whoever did this, Dorinda said slowly, knew his schedule. I didn't say anything, but we were thinking the same name. I want to be honest about something. Suspecting someone and knowing are 2 different things, and I was raised to understand that difference. My daddy used to say, "Don't pick up a rock unless you're ready to see what's under it." I wasn't ready. But my son was sitting in a detention center, and his bail hearing was in 2 days, and I didn't have time to be cautious. Dorinda used her contacts from her deputy years to pull public records on the Windham Housing Cooperative. Nonprofits have to file annual reports. She knew where to look and what to look for. What she found took us a day and a half to fully understand. The cooperative had been processing an unusual volume of consulting contracts, vague agreements with firms that provided no specific deliverables, paid in lump sums with no follow-up reporting. 7 firms in 3 years. Dorinda cross-referenced the business registrations. 2 of the firms shared the same registered agent. One listed a Charlotte address that turned out to be a UPS store on Providence Road. The money flowing out through those contracts was not $300,000. It was millions. "She's been running a scheme," Dorinda said. It wasn't a question. The renovation funds, the contractor accounts. Quinton walked into the wrong place at the wrong time. I thought about my son going through project documents. I thought about him being thorough, careful, checking twice. I thought about what he might have noticed and what he might have asked. I called him at the jail that evening. "Before all this started," I said, "did you ever ask anyone about the consultant contracts? Question anything in the cooperative's finances?" The silence lasted long enough that I knew. "I asked Greer," he said quietly. "About 6 weeks ago, I was reviewing the project account and I saw a payment go out to one of those firms. The amount didn't match any line item I had. I asked her directly if it was supposed to be there." "What did she say?" "That it was a separate operating expense, that I didn't need to worry about it." He paused. "Mom, I let it go. I should have pushed harder." "You had no reason to think she'd turn it around on you." "His wife knew," he said suddenly, and his voice had changed. "Quieter, harder. She knew I'd asked. I told her that night. I told her everything, and she told me to drop it. Said her mother had a complicated way of running things, but it was all legitimate. Said I should focus on my own work." 6 weeks later, he was arrested. I sat in that hotel room for a long time after I hung up. Dorinda was at the desk with her legal pad and her coffee. I looked at my hands, strong hands, my mama's hands. There are moments when you feel something shift inside you. Not anger exactly, though anger is part of it. Something older and steadier than anger. A kind of certainty. My grandmother used to call it knowing your feet, knowing where you stand, what ground you're standing on, and that it belongs to you. I knew my feet that night. We needed someone who could act. Not the police. Dorinda had contacts, but the Windham family had contributed generously to local political campaigns, and we had no guarantee a report wouldn't disappear into a drawer. Not the press. Not yet. Not without ironclad documentation. We needed Forrest Windham. I knew almost nothing about the man. He and Greer had been married 38 years, but operated in largely separate spheres. He attended family dinners occasionally, polite and distant, the kind of man who asks about football scores as a substitute for conversation. But he was a businessman, and according to Dorinda's research, a careful one. His development company was profitable, well-managed, and entirely separate from the cooperative. He doesn't know, Dorinda said, about any of it. You can see it in the company filings. He's kept everything clean on his end. Or he's covering himself. Maybe, but I think he's a man who's just not been paying attention. She set down her pen. Men like that, when you show them what not paying attention has cost them, they get very focused, very fast. We met him at a Panera off South Park on a Thursday afternoon. That was Dorinda's idea. Neutral, public, unremarkable, she said. He can't make a scene and he won't feel cornered. He came alone, which surprised me. I had half expected a lawyer. He was taller than I remembered from family dinners, mid-60s, silver-haired, with the deliberate posture of a man who'd been reminding himself to stand up straight since his 30s. He looked at me, then at Dorinda, and sat down without greeting. My son is in jail, I said, no preamble, for something your wife did. He didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. That's a serious allegation. Yes, it is. I put the folder on the table between us, and I have serious documentation to back it up. Dorinda walked him through it methodically. The shell companies, the consultant contracts with no deliverables, the transfer timestamps matched against Quinton's field schedule, the conversation my son had with Greer 6 weeks before his arrest. By the time she finished, Forrest had not moved, had barely blinked, but his hands, pressed flat on the table, were white at the knuckles. How much? He asked. Our estimate, based on the public filings, is between 1.2 and 2 million, Dorinda said. Could be more. He nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming something he had almost already known. My son told his wife about the irregular payment the night he found it, I said. She told him to drop it. Did she tell you anything? Something behind his eyes shifted. No, he said, she did not. There was a weight in that answer I recognized. Not just denial, grief. The quiet grief of a person discovering, in real time, the true shape of someone they thought they knew. What do you want? He asked. My son's charges dropped, I said. The scheme addressed properly, and a guarantee that your wife never comes near my son or his life again. And if I handle it, you step back? If you handle it, Dorinda said, we step back. If you don't, we take everything we have to the state attorney's office and the Charlotte Observer at the same time. A pause. We have nothing against you personally, Mr. Windham. But we will protect Quinton by whatever means we have. He looked at me for a long moment. There was something in his face I hadn't expected. Not respect exactly, but recognition. Like he was looking at someone he understood. 72 hours, he said. We were already standing when he spoke again. Mrs. Jarvis, he was looking at his hands. Your son. Greer never treated him as though he belonged in this family. I noticed. I just didn't do anything about it. He didn't say he was sorry. He was too honest for that. That's on me. I looked at him for a moment. Yes, I said it is. On the third day, Quentin's attorney called. The charges had been withdrawn. The authorization signatures, the transaction logs. All of it walked back by the cooperative's board after an emergency internal review prompted by an anonymous tip. Quinton was released that evening. I met him in the parking lot. He walked out in the same clothes he'd been arrested in, and he looked thinner, older around the eyes. But he was walking straight. I held him for a long time and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the hug didn't say better. Later, in a diner over coffee and eggs, he told me his wife had called that afternoon. That she was sorry, that she'd been afraid of her mother her whole life, that she should have told him to report it the night he first brought it to her. She knew, he said. When I told her what I'd found, she knew what her mother would do, and she chose to stay quiet. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. I keep thinking, if I hadn't had you and Aunt Dorinda, I could have stayed in that place, gone to trial, lost everything, and she would have let it happen. I didn't offer an opinion. That was his decision to make. What I didn't tell him that night, what Dorinda had uncovered 3 days after his arrest, was that Greer had done something else. 2 years before Quentin was framed, she had contacted the managing director of the firm where he worked, had described him in careful and deniable language as someone with a tendency to ask uncomfortable questions about project finances. The director had flagged it internally. The flag had not resulted in any action. Quinton was too good at his job, but it had sat there, quiet, waiting. Greer had been working to loosen his footing for 2 full years before she pushed him. I told Quentin about it 2 weeks later, when he was staying near me and we'd had dinner, and the television was on low, and I thought he could hold something hard without it breaking him. He went very still. She started working against me before I even knew there was anything to find, he said. She saw what you were before you saw it yourself. He was quiet for a long time. I didn't rush him. Dad always said, he finally said, that doing good work makes you visible to the right eyes. He looked at me. I guess he didn't account for the wrong ones. He also said, I reminded him that you don't move a mountain by worrying about it. You start digging. He almost smiled at that. Forrest Windham called me once, about a month later. Greer had entered a treatment program in Vermont. Voluntary, though I had the sense that Word was doing some heavy lifting. The Cooperatives Board had commissioned an independent audit. The funds would be recovered to the extent possible. He said he was sorry. I thanked him and meant it. In the limited way, you can mean something that comes accompanied by a disaster. He also said, whatever my daughter did or didn't do, that was not something I raised her to do. I didn't teach her that courage was non-negotiable. I should have. No, I said, you should have. He accepted that. Dorinda went back to Raleigh in December. Before she left, we sat on the hotel balcony with bad coffee and looked at the Charlotte skyline going gray in the early dark. You know what Mama would say, she said. She'd say we should have called a lawyer. She'd say that, and then she'd say she was proud of us. Dorinda sipped her coffee. We didn't have money or connections or friends in the right places. We had sense enough to look and nerve enough to act. She glanced at me. That's not nothing, Cleo. She's right, it's not. Quentin is renting an apartment in Charlotte now. He found a new position with a firm that does municipal water infrastructure work. Meaningful work, he calls it. Work that matters to regular people. He sounds like himself on the phone again. Sometimes a little quieter, but himself. I drove up in February to have dinner with him. We went to a barbecue place he'd been meaning to try and talked for 3 hours. At one point, he mentioned he'd run into his ex-wife's attorney during the divorce proceedings and heard she was struggling, anxious, seeing a therapist. I asked him how that made him feel. Sorry for her, he said, but not sorry enough to go back. That seemed right to me. I've been thinking lately about my daddy, about what he used to say when I was young, and things got hard and I couldn't see a way through. He'd put his big hand on top of my head and say, Cleo, you are made of people who didn't quit. Don't shame them. I'm made of people who loaded trucks and cleaned houses and showed up anyway. Who built something from nothing and held it with both hands. Who found, when truly pressed that they had more in them than the world ever gave them credit for. That's what I am. That's what Quentin is. That's the thing Windham looked at and underestimated. That particular stubbornness, that particular refusal to be unmade. She thought it was softness, that we were soft because we were honest, because we worked without schemes, because we didn't build safety nets from other people's ruin. She was wrong about that. My son called me last Sunday evening. We talked for almost an hour about his new project, about plans for the summer, about whether I'd finally replace my 12-year-old car. Before we hung up, he said, "Mom, thank you for coming." "You're my son," I said. "Where else would I be?" It was dark outside by then, and I sat for a while after we hung up with the lights off, listening to the neighborhood. A dog somewhere, a car turning in, all the ordinary sounds of people living their hard-built lives. Windham had everything: the name, the platform, the polished image, the connections. And she still couldn't stop herself from taking more. And in the end, what finished her was not a grand investigation, not an enemy with power or money. It was a retired principal from Birmingham and her sister sitting in a Panera Bread with a legal pad and the truth. My daddy used to say, "Baby, the truth doesn't need you to dress it up. It just needs someone willing to carry it." I carried it, Dorinda carried it. And Quinton, with the light back in his eyes and the sauce on his collar, laughing at that barbecue place in February. Quinton's going to carry it forward. That's enough. That is more than enough.